Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Build Weekly Roundup 2025. A lot has happened over the last week, both from a legislative perspective here in the US, but also in terms of foreign policy, what we're seeing abroad. So I'm really, excited to have Matt here to be able to talk me through what he's seeing in terms of how this might actually impact capital markets, equity markets broadly. But I think let's just start off with kind of the three topics that we're going to be going over today. Number one is Iran. Number two is the passing of the Genius Act. And number three is some more rumblings in terms of the supplemental leverage ratio. So, I want to call out ahead of time that Matt has actually been, again, pinpoint with each of his topics over the last couple of weeks, and we're just seeing that further play out here. So, Matt, we talked a bit before in terms of Israel Iran. I think for any of our viewers who were watching Twitter or the news over the last couple of days, I'm sure it's the only thing that has been hitting your news feed. Just seeing missiles, the Iron Dome taking out incoming missiles from Iran, Israel blowing up buildings in Tehran. So, Matt, I'd love to kind of hear your take on what this means for us in capital markets.
Yeah, first let's settle out and make sure we can agree on what's happened
Hmm.
because this was a huge deal. And then I want to get into the kind of the implications on what this means for the overall narrative arc that we've been trying to describe for you on a weekly cadence with this weekly roundup review of what's changing on global capital markets. But in real and down to brass tacks, this is kind of Game of Thrones on the global reordering that's been taking place since at least 2008. That was kind of the financial mile marker, but really all of this process, in my opinion, kind of kick-started in 9/11 on 9/11 with the attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. But we've been, developing kind of, you get some, you know, good descriptive kind of mental models of trying to understand this process as we're living through it in real time. It's hard to see history when you don't have the history book, right, developing in front of you. Um, but if you try to anchor yourself, build out your map, start with a good model of what's going on. Hopefully that helps make sense of these developments like we've seen in the last week with Iran and specifically Israel. It goes deeper than that. Uh, but as we get these kind of micro stories, how do you make sense of them? If you tack this one chapter onto the wall of volumes that we're racking up on the shelf to describe this whole kind of historical epoch. So, what happened in Iran last week? So we titled this episode "The Battle of Fordow." Fordow is the not the primary uranium enrichment facility, right? The catalyst for all of this, right? And it's been like the last 2 decades has been Iran, the current we call it just religious regime that's in power that holds power through the IRGC, or Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Um, Really, you see, like, all right, how does a regime really establish itself so that it doesn't get overthrown, right? Or kind of hostile takeover conducted upon it by a foreign power. Well, we know in the post-World War II environment, the number one thing to ensure sovereignty is nuclear weapons, right? Nuclear capabilities. Um, what's the quote? Like, no government that possesses nuclear weapons has ever been, conquered, invaded, et cetera. You just don't mess with people who have that sort of pushback ability. And so this pressure has been building up. Like, we followed it throughout the 2010s, the JCPOA, all of that endeavor to ensure that Iran never develops nuclear capabilities, right? And this has been, foremost for Israel from a security risk standpoint. But also Iran's neighbors in the Middle East do not want to see Iran possess nuclear capabilities. We've seen kind of like throughout the 2010s and into the post-COVID 2020 environment, um, Iran really being a disruptor throughout the region, right? Like in the post-US invasion, second time of Iraq that removed Saddam Hussein from power, left that country with no stable government, right? Well, who came in? The Iranians came in through their proxies, caused chaos, disorder, and you can say the same thing, just throughout little hotspots, other parties throughout the Middle East. So no one in the Middle East really wanted to see Iran get a nuclear weapon, and besides maybe their fellow Shia countries, to some extent. But they were really close, is my understanding from what I'm reading. So they enriched uranium up to 60%. That's well past civilian grade, not quite enough like to the 90% threshold to deploy into a nuclear weapon. But it wasn't that much further away, right? Going from 60 to that 90 and crossing that last portion was probably within their existing capabilities. So it was really
Hard but
time to do
doable.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah, hard but doable, right? So just given the clock, the Trump 2.0 administration had mentioned, publicly that they were in open negotiations. That timeline just ran out, over the last week. Iran continued to press towards that nuclear capability. It's kind of that same attempt to go for it, right? You're left at the fork in the road. Take some sort of deal with the U.S. To kind of guarantee there would be no nuclear weapon capabilities, or do you just go for it? Try to break the jail, and once you're there, you have it. And I think the takeaway after the last week is Iran, starting with Ayatollah Khamenei, gambled and lost. Would be my perspective. It comes down to, I think, really, just extremely impressive execution by the Israelis. Um, from a personnel standpoint, and you can go read the news articles to catch yourself up on this, but basically all of the key nuclear research scientists were taken off the board. Key members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard off the board. So leadership ranks and research capabilities are decimated. Um, the key facility in the Nance for uranium enrichment has been, I think, crippled. And then there's one remaining facility. If you've seen the Top Gun 2 movie, right? The whole plot design is around this ultimate conclusion, or ultimate they call it, like, just the challenge that needs to be overcome is basically the dropping of some bunker busting bombs, right? And so this really is just another example of Hollywood kind of front running the real world military industrial complex, right? So this nuclear facility, Fordow, kind of subject of title here, the Battle of Fordow. It's I want to say, is it like 90 meters below the surface? Something like that.
Can't remember
Double
exactly
check
how
my
deep, but it is built
double
into
check
the
my facts.
side of a mountain,
Yeah,
underneath a mountain, effectively. So they really designed it to be able to withstand most attacks. But obviously, I think the U.S. has known about this for a while. We kind of know what we need to do if we want to take it out, but it would be very
yeah,
difficult.
yeah. So you need the U.S. bunker busting bombs, which is kind of a unique capability from a military standpoint, is the consensus that's being communicated in the press. And yeah, basically the plot of Top Gun 2, right? It was, well, you had four fighter jets basically split off into two teams of two. The first group of two, you have one jet that's covering the tail, if you will, protecting from interceptors. The first jet who is supposed to deploy a missile, like a first round, missile, torpedo, what have you, uh, hit the target right on the money. And then the second team of two comes in and they have to drop like essentially into that well, the deeper bunker buster to really take out the facility. Just shocking how on point Top Gun 2 was preparing the mass American public and global public for exactly what we're seeing and living through in June of 2025. Uncanny, one might
It's
say.
almost like there's a connection somehow. Who knows?
Almost, yeah. It's almost like we were preparing the American public for this. Uh, but my point here, this is a huge development, right? Because it takes off a board one of the key um, just conflict points for the global power struggle that we talk about, on previous episodes of Weekly Roundup for this multipolar world. You've obviously got Russia and China as the land powers on the Eurasian continent. You got America as kind of the land power in the Western Hemisphere. And then you've got the legacy power, the European continent. And so my point here, so this situation with Iran, this takes off the board, one of those key points of conflict. And this opens up everything in the kind of, we talked about the post 2001, post 2008 transition to the global order. What's being worked towards is a peace in the Middle East, as crazy as that sounds, in my point of view. This is like the original Trump Abrahamic Accords. What Iran, taking away the nuclear kind of end game, that's off the table now. Iran's not getting the nuke. It's just a matter of what happens from here. How does the last chapter get written? And there's multiple ways it could go. But that end game of Iran as a government possessing nuclear capabilities, in my opinion, that's off the board now after Thursday evening, last week's developments. So what does that represent? Well, that's one of the key kind of trading pieces between, all of those four kind of regional powers that I mentioned about earlier. So you take, the threat of a nuclear armed Iran off the board, you can now kind of redraw the lines, the boundaries in the Middle East, so that these countries aren't continuously at war with each other, different cultural, ethnic groups at war with each other. And they can finally, knock on wood, this has probably never been the case, or I say finally, like temporarily at least for potentially as long as a lifetime, if things go well, something like that. But establish a new order where we can stop fighting, everybody aligns their own directions, and we just begin kind of cooperating again. That's the hopeful vision. Now, what did I put up here on the screen for Cameron to show? This is a chart from a book by hedge fund manager Barton Biggs, published back in 2008. But what he talks about is when you see these big kind of developments on the kind of nation state, conflict scene, these big inflection points will usually show up in financial markets, right? And so a textbook point, right? You look at World War II, did not look great for the U.S. and the Allied powers up until the Battle of Midway, right? You can see the key points here on the from the U.S. perspective during the conflict, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average was actually in sell-off from the time we entered the war. Can't have to go back, and then the bottoming actually happens just before the U.S. makes the decisive, turning point in the Pacific of Midway, right? Battle of Midway. I won't spend 10 minutes here discussing Battle of Midway, but massively important, naval battle. this is something we need to continue to watch. But what just happened in Iran, I think taking off that nuclear threat, now we can progress, from that, key unknown or key variable, key point of conflict, whatever you want to call it. That's resolved. Now we can move forward from financial markets. Like uncertainty, like actual uncertainty has been removed. We know how this plays out. What do I mean there? Well, we talked about those regional powers. Some of them are cooperating or aligned with certain things happen, and some are not. So who is an antagonist? Who wants to see this happen? Um, I won't say too much on that topic, how I view things. Um, but I will say this. So it's very clear. All right, Israel was the driver of this past week's action with the it kind of just goes beyond just a blessing of the United States, right? There's the key point of involvement that the U.S. would need to actually step in on would be the drop of those bunker busters to fully
The
take out
B2s. Yep.
Fordow. Yeah, you need our B2 capabilities. Apparently, that's the only aircraft heavy and with the that can actually transport and carry a missile with that weight and heft. So U.S. didn't contribute directly in the fight. They're maybe providing intelligence or some coordination ops, um, but they're definitely tacitly involved. Now, who else is involved? Well, if you go to the next slide, Cameron, do I have put the euro in here? But maybe this is a good one to talk about oil first, right? So if you go to the next slide, Cameron, one. Sorry, I get to oil. We should have done more show notes and prep ahead of time to organize the narrative. All right. So when you look at what happened to the oil markets, right? We've been talking like for the past decade. There's chatter. What if Iran retaliates to something like what we just saw in the last week by shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, which would send oil prices skyrocketing, markets panic, skyrocketing oil cripples the global economy, et cetera, et cetera. Iran didn't take those specific actions in the Strait of Hormuz because, they imply, I talked about things can, take like this last chapter of this specific book, maybe that's being written on the Iran nuclear threat kind of topic, that can still go a few ways here. But I think we just saw the climax. Now with the resolution is, the final episode of the season, usually pretty boring, right? If they did want to send oil higher, they could probably do it temporarily, but there's a huge cost. It'll be like it'll basically result in their annihilation from a military perspective. The regime's out, no chance for reform. So it seems right now that's not the approach they're going to take. We'll know probably in the next days and over the coming days and weeks, how that story develops. But on the first kind of reaction to Israel takes this, massive coordinated military attack on Iran. Most people probably would have told you the expectation, what happens to WTI oil prices. If you ask people on the street, just describe last week's development, it probably wouldn't be uncommon to hear people say $120 oil, 150, 200, 250, right? Well, what's reality here? It's 75. So this squeeze, the geopolitical risk, squeeze on Iran. The spike has only been so far. This could continue, and oil might. This is not inconsistent with saying oil and other commodities should trend higher in the medium term. It's probably something I would agree with. But the initial reaction on the supply squeeze, this was like not much, right? We were already going into this with oil at a low, $55 to $60 range. Why was that? Well, that tells you where you're at in the kind of the global dollar credit cycle. Growth is growth is soft, energy demand slowing. Um, and then on top of that, you had Saudi around announcement that they were going to pick up supply production. So you don't necessarily have to have full coordination here. You just have to have, um, tacit understanding between Israel, United States, probably cooperating on a military front on this exercise, or, maybe not fully, right? Israel's the actual hammer; they are the sword. U.S. is not. So want to be careful about what I say about like using the specific word coordination. They're definitely aware. And then Saudi Arabia, maybe not coordinating, maybe not agreed on plans, etc., but they're tangoing, right? You don't want to see the spike. What prohibits the site uh, squeeze in oil markets on geopolitical risk? Well, Saudi Arabia is the slack producer, right? And we just saw them uh, increase the taps.
Because they didn't have a plan ahead of time to. This wasn't a pre-announced thing saying in a month from now we're going to increase supply. This was actually in response to what's going on. Is that correct?
Yeah, and part of this came out of, Trump's visit to the Middle East, probably about 3, 4 weeks ago at this point, where he really reset the American, relationship with the Gulf Coast, with the change of administration. But, we're not privy to every single discussion that's had, but like everything we're seeing is kind of, part of strategic execution.
Seeing closer
And
alignment that way. Yep.
yeah, and it's not, there's different ways that this could have gone. It's just, if Iran does this, then we do this. If this, then that. Everybody's, coordinating, operate all of the major players and secondary players, uh, are playing off of each other. But I think the broader point there on the financial tape, you would see this, right? Like the same thing, Battle of Midway. Um, I mean, the way I view this was a key linchpin on everything going on between, this global reset between the regional powers, US, EU, Russia, China. This was massive. You got to think who wanted to see this happen, who didn't. Um, and then you look for that in the financial markets on the like the tier one assets that everybody needs to follow. And so the one I would watch, the closest here, what's the next, like who has the ball in their court now, right? I would I would estimate it's probably the EU, the euro, right? This actually took something off the table from them from the geopolitical angle. Uh, and now they have to respond to their own credit, sovereign debt, and economic situation uh, with kind of the check passed to them, right? So I think that's what I would continue to watch, as we put more weeks and months as you're looking for signal. So you look for assets. What put in a top on that overnight between June 12th and June 13th, right? And there's a few things, but notably, the euro uh, put in its top, the pound put in its top, gold actually on Friday rallied into its all-time high for a weekly close, not an all-time intraday high of 3,500 it hit um, back in April. But I would watch the key developments now on FX and in particular, number one, I'd say what's the EU's next step here? How do they react to this development? That that doesn't mean there's still cleanup to be done between the climax and resolution on Iran, right? There's still work there, still, things that could happen. But I would now turn my attention for the remainder of the summer heading into fall to what happens with the EU. So other episodes we've already mentioned prior weeks. EU planned has announced plans for a CBDC rollout Q3, Q4, 2025. They've got the Savings and Investment Union. They're on the hook for funding more military spending to increase their share of NATO budget that they're bringing to the table. And then there's the whole Ukraine situation. So I think this actually puts the ball in EU's court.
It's really interesting because at the same time, we've also got the tariffs question with the EU, right? And it sounded like, as of recent news, there's still some tension between kind of the Trump admin and what the EU wants out of those tariff deals. So just kind of curious to see all of this start to come to a head. And I think we've mentioned on previous episodes as well that early July timeframe. I think that's even when the tariffs for the EU are supposed to go into effect, right? So all of this coming ahead. This is mid-June right now. We're 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks out. All coming to a head at the same time is very, very interesting.
We'll talk about like who's got the shortest rope, right? Because it's all, uh, you know, everybody's got a credit problem, right? But it's all a matter of who has to ease or default or debase the currency first. So we'll go over what the U.S. is doing because we have good line of sight and actually some developments this week. So the U.S. has wiggle room. EU has to do other other stuff like more aggressive
Find a way to
type.
kind of push people into doing what they want rather than
Yeah,
using the market
exactly.
forces.
So should we shift over to Genius Act?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. And just I'll put this up just for our viewers here. Just to kind of explain further. We talked about Fordow. That's the spot in the middle. I'll highlight this here with the laser pointer. But we've seen explosions across multiple other Iranian sites. So just to kind of illustrate what's actually happening, the extent of the damage that's been done
Yeah.
against Iran.
It's not the main nuclear reactor, but it's the deepest, most well protected, not reactor, sorry, enrichment facility.
Right.
And how that winds down from here, it could go, hey, we need to go demolish it with the bunker busters. If Iran wants to take the hard route, okay, that's one way it can progress. Could also progress with some sort of negotiation, voluntary destruction. It closes without the bunker busters and a more peaceful route, I guess you would say. Like Trump's social truths he posted. It just sounds weird to say they're truths, right? But he said there's the easy way, and then there's the other way, and the other way is really it's the B2s.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move over then to the Genius Act. So, I can tee this up a little bit here. We've talked about this in previous episodes. This is the act that would enable a legal framework around stablecoin issuance here in the United States. Matt had a lot of really good callouts in a previous episode that I would recommend folks watch. You can go through kind of our back catalog if you want to see those. But we actually saw this pass with a majority yays. You got 69% yays versus 31% nays. And while it was a largely partisan divide in terms of votes, you did see 18 Democrats actually also vote alongside them. So, Matt, I'm curious from your perspective how this kind of pushes that stablecoin issuance along, as well as we hinted at maybe some other ways to induce demand for treasuries.
Yep. So, I mean, just to start here, I think this is happening. It's when you think about when you have you know single party control of House, Senate, and presidency. What you usually see within those 2 years is some headline or like legacy type of policy that they'll push through. So an example here would be the Obama Affordable Care Act, right? That's what they wanted to go to for the legacy. And then history tells you, did it work or not? And usually the case when these happen is the answer is pretty typically no. I think 15 years or roughly from the hindsight of ACA, yeah, didn't do what it was supposed to do, which was solve the affordability crisis for healthcare in the United States. It's this isn't controversial or a left-right spectrum. I think it's pretty clear with the data. It did not accomplish that objective. And then you get into things like Great Society initiatives, Lyndon Johnson. It's like, well, those, with the passage of history reveals, well, that was also kind of, I guess you could call it did work, right? We didn't have a senior citizen class that's living in poverty, right? But have the programs, cost what we initially thought it did? Well, the answer is no. Like to this day, the senators talk about how wrong the CBO estimates were on how much it would actually cost the United States federal government to run the Great Society program. So these big acts that you get through, or just policy that that pushes ahead, like as a what do we call it, like a mandate initiative coming out of an election. Um, they don't always work, right? But they got to, when you're sent to Washington in an election with that type of
You have
result,
to try
usually,
something.
yeah, usually the party feels like, yeah, do something, right? So the answer is, will this work? TBD. I find it particularly interesting and the notable uh, kind of party crossovers, the yeses and the nos. And I think Cameron, you had this. Let me see if I can bring up that website. So the notable
While you're doing that for our
yay
viewers, I'll try to
nays.
see if I can do this on the fly. Uh,
Yeah.
sometimes it's
So,
not great.
oh, you can just mention because there's four, right? There's two
That's right.
Democrats. So the key ones were Padilla from California. He flipped to a yes, broke with kind of the Democratic consensus. You can see it on the left of the chamber diagram there. You've got a lot of blue defections, right? The shaded squares are the yays. This on the left-right spectrum, right? But the nays were the Democrat, like we're coming from the Democratic coalition. So the key flips, two of them. Number one, Cory Booker from New Jersey, kind of legacy senator, and then Alex Padilla. Padilla is in a unique situation. He was a Gavin Newsom appointee uh, for, I want to say, was it Dianne Feinstein when she was kind of ushered out of the Senate could no longer fulfill her duties. Uh, it's kind of looking now like Padilla's got an interesting situation in front of him for 2026, 2028. What happens with Gavin Newsom's political career? He's either going to run for president or he'll want this Senate seat that Padilla's actually sitting in that he appointed him to. So Padilla has to kind of carve out some name recognition, build up a base that he never had, right? It was like, what's the goal of every politician, right? Well, it's to extend your career, um, and make some hay for most of them while the going is good. So that one from Padilla, I think, is interesting on the flip. Now, the two nays from the Republicans who broke with their coalition, number one, Rand Paul is probably the most interesting. I'll get into that second.
Yeah.
Josh Hawley from Missouri is first. Try to find a reason. Why would Josh Hawley be a nay here and break from the Republican coalition? The only thing I can find on the dive deep on that is his father is, kind of a legacy banking executive, not JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo City, like big Bank of America, big bank. It's regional bank. And I would say the most threatened entities here from what's going on with stablecoins and kind of a ledger-based IOU, public ledger-based IOU, tokenized, immutable, all that stuff. What is that most threatened? I think obviously it's the credit-based banking model, fractional reserve. But when you look at the regional banks, right, usually they're the most pure play, kind of dependent on that credit banking model. You don't have investment banking, you don't have payments, merchant banking, other income streams, in the fiat system, as Bitcoiners have labeled it. And so if you're just entirely based on or dependent on deposit based, funding into, loan creation, you know, 535 banking, as it used to be called, right? Or no, no, sorry, 353 banking, borrow at three, lend at five on the golf course by three. If that's kind of well, that's been dead for 50, 60 years and dying. But if that's the family business and you think this is a threat, I think, maybe Josh Hawley represents a holdover for that coalition. I don't think that has any lasting, political movement, like trying to see, uh, the how this plays out over the longer term, 5 years, 10 years. I don't think that coalition will, it's not gathering momentum. But what maybe is, I think, the nay that Rand Paul represents, right? If we dive deep on Rand Paul, obvious son of Ron Paul, gold advocate, probably the hardest, staunchest holdout resistant to fractional reserve banking on a full credit money standard, right? Without any hard backing reserves behind the system. I think, Rand Paul's nay seems like it's coming from a different ideological place. Um, I don't think there's that much, pragmatism behind this vote. He doesn't have a coalition to go with him. This seems like a thing to me. I just read a book. I just finished a book. Most recent on my reading list was Barbara Tuchman's The March of Folly, and it's got a chapter in it, or not even a chapter, a whole section on this, brick of a book about the Vietnam War. And the thing you'd highlight there, or I'd highlight there were two senators who were just throughout the entire experience of Vietnam, they were hard nosed. Like they saw what was coming, and the whole Vietnam situation developed over 19 years and progressively got worse. Um, I think Rand Paul, where he stands ideologically, what he represents in his no, why he doesn't want to see the Genius Act, because essentially what this is just porting over the same old system onto this new crypto rails. Um, I think that's what's behind his no. So it seems more like, in my perspective, he's on the right wave, coming from the right place, and I think the Bitcoin movement, the actual, Bitcoiners who um, appreciate Bitcoin for what it is, the public trustless ledger money, the only solution, decentralized solution to the Byzantine generals problem. I think that's what that wave represents. So that's just something I find or found interesting in this Genius Act passage.
That's
And
like
this is an environment where there's a big vote coming up on OBBBA, the one big beautiful bill, and it's very clear. This is you got to whip the votes, right? And Rand Paul's vote here, you're like, all right, it doesn't seem like it was for sale, right? Which also opens him up to what's the next step to if his vote is needed. Well, if you can't win it by horse trading, well, then you got to get it by other means. So you can kind of do the math there and figure that one out. But I think there is a broader kind of social wave behind that nay vote that Rand Paul represents going against his coalition.
makes sense. And that was I was gonna say that that's an interesting call out because at first blush I saw his name pop up and I was thinking, full reserve stablecoin seems like that would be more in line with what some of his ideas or his ideology points towards. But to your point, there's kind of that broader ideology that he's got going on that I think you've identified correctly.
Yep. All right. So we gotta close this out pretty quickly. I gotta head to a doctor's appointment. But let's get into the SLR.
Yep, because they again, and just to set the stage again, it's another piece on that thread of inducing treasury demand.
Yeah.
But yeah, Matt, I'll let you take this one away. But I just saw the news come up the other day. I pinged it over to Matt, and just as a reminder that he's been right on this one the whole way through. So go for it.
Yeah, this has not been a well-kept secret. This has been right out in the open. So there's these enhanced supplementary leverage ratio. Essentially what they do is they add capital reserve requirements to um, any banks that are deemed GSIBs, globally systemically important banks, under Basel III, right? So it's under Basel III is this kind of patchwork that's managed by the Bank of International Settlements that brings all the central banks together. And that's kind of their protocol is these Basel Accords that stitch the whole thing together so that capital can transactions can take place internationally, right? So this enhanced supplementary leverage ratio was basically it's just an extra reserve that your largest, we used to call them too big to fail banks kind of in the media, but basically your big banks, and I think there's 30 of them globally, might have gone down to 29 because Credit Suisse was one of them, and they've been taken off the board, merged into UBS. But the US, I forget exactly when this went on, at some point, I would guess in the 2010s, there was ESLR relief during, I want to say COVID, right, as a emergency measure. But this was, it's on the each country, to put this regulation, enforce this regulation on its GSIB. So this basically amounts to, hey, for a bank against, what is on its U.S. Treasury holdings, how much capital does it need to reserve against those on this supplementary leverage ratio measurement, right? And so what it means is, all right, if I get rid of that, banks can technically own treasury. These five can utilize more of their balance sheets or grow their balance sheets, allocate more to treasuries, and then that actually creates effects downstream with other credit creation that can take place. And I'll go into my view of where the rubber meets the road here, what's going to happen, right? Because I think everybody's well aware. All right, the U.S. government, from a budget standpoint, we're in a pickle, right? Running massive deficits. There's no recession, and if there is a recession, that just makes the entire problem worse, right? Because the automatic stabilizers, all of that needs to kick in. Um, so we need something that will allow us to thread the needle. We can't allow the U.S. economy at this point to go into a nominal recession. Um, and then we also need to reduce the interest burden, the debt service that the U.S. Treasury has to pay its debt holders. And then also at the same time, we want to grow nominal GDP, as Treasury Secretary Bissett said on the Sunday morning talk shows 3 weeks ago, I believe, where basically the announcement was, hey, we're going to run it hot. We're going to grow nominal GDP faster than the actual
And then
debt grows,
inflation, yeah.
and that will over time lower the debt to GDP, right? So what's actually going on here? Why does the 10-year matter? So the biggest thing, we'll get into the bank balance sheets in a second and how this will work through the system. But the real correlation between the 10-year, right? The 10-year bond, check how much is there outstanding. Um, it's it's not that much of the US Treasury's total funding, right? Like everybody knows, like as we've run up this deficit situation and we crank up the national debt to 37 trillion, the duration of the debt outstanding has moved down, right? To the point where something like about 20 or over 20% of the debt is now front end T-bills, right? So duration on the overall debt is coming down. My point there, banks don't necessarily need to fund a ton of the 30-year or, remember when everybody panicked about the 20-year auction that tailed by over a bit over a month ago at this point. That's not really what matters here, right? Because like very little of the overall debt is on the long end. The 10-year matters for consumer credit creation, and where the rubber meets the road is mortgages, right? 10-year rate sets it's your benchmark rate for the 15 and 30-year mortgages, right? So if you look at it, like I put a slide in with the TBA mortgage pools in a second. It goes through the size, right? So if the 10-year Treasury, the current coupon bond is somewhere between 50 and 100 billion dollars outstanding by the time they hold the 3 monthly auctions. There's one primary and then two reopenings. These mortgage pools, like the Fannie and Freddie, as just one kind of section of the overall residential credit creation industry, which is your biggest hitter, your largest source of private sector household debt creation. Your 15 and 30-year mortgage like rates need to hold up, right, to keep the private economy going, to keep nominal GDP humming along. And so, yeah, as Cameron has right now, I think you have the slide with, $68 billion in Fannie and Freddie loans outstanding, and that's on the February 2025 issue date. So these will come out quarterly. So we need the credit creation just humming along, flowing through the pipes for this for the U.S. economy, for the system, and then downstream of that would be the federal debt just to keep humming along. My point here, Cameron, if you go back one slide, what I've got here is in white is the 10-year future, and specifically the forward yield to maturity on the cheapest to deliver. This is what the street will price against for its cost of capital on funding a mortgage, right? Because to go out and create all these originations, you have to do just a bunch of hedging transactions. So tapping, say, the futures market would be one of the key sources. But you look at that yield on the 10-year future, that's got to respond to the actual housing starts in the real economy, right? Because your housing starts will front run your mortgages. If you think about this as a pipeline, right? Well, you start, if you're going to build a new unit of real estate, right? What do? Start with a permit, then you get your credit financing taken care of with your bank or some other financial institution. Then you officially start construction. A lot of times you'll market it. You'll do the real estate listing on call it a pre-build. Happens quite often or in a hot real estate market. And then you get into like sales, right? And so the actual consumer mortgage will come during that completion process. It's like manufacturing any other type of good, but this one in particular, just because of the size and the purchase amount relative to the American worker or consumers, balance sheet assets, it's credit financed. So the financing is hugely important to keeping this key sector of the U.S. economy, housing, humming along. Now, housing starts, I got the 6-month moving average in orange, and you can see that it correlates with that yield, right? So what am I getting at here? The dots on the housing start are actually, there's a monthly time series that's reported. It actually just reported this morning, and in light of all this other stuff going on. And there was a massive miss on housing starts. Now, 1 month doesn't make a trend, but when you look at the overall trend, of housing starts, I didn't zoom out the full way here, but from basically post 2008, once you get into 2010, 2011, the housing starts bottom after the 2008 crisis, right? It's uptrend all 2010s up until the steam wears out in 2021, 2022 on all that COVID stimulus that came through and kept the party going. Well, now we're in the hangover. And you can see here, if you look at the moving average, the housing starts, it's trending down now. We're in decline. We're going the other direction, right? And so this miss now, what this tells you, the yellow dot I just posted, this housing starts number that came in for May, missed survey estimates, what it's telling you is the real economy, the gravity, the direction of trend is actually down. So what do you need to do to kickstart the real economy back up, keep your nominal GDP going, keep it possible to grow it faster than the um, debt outstanding itself? Well, you need to get the 10-year rate to come in, right? So I'd say the key here with the ESLR, you want to fire this weapon. We've had it in store. We were talking about this last summer. I recorded a special episode with Nick Bhatia on the Bitcoin layer that goes over the educational, like the ins and outs of the ESLR and capital requirements post 2008. If you want to go back and watch that, maybe we'll link to it in the show notes. But what do you do here, right? You need the ESLR to increase capacity of treasuries, right? And then when you lower rates, so the reason that housing starts are low is because the American consumer, like there's no demand, like there's a demand shortfall. Why is oil at 75 as well? That's growth, that's demand that are low. So to go and incentivize the American worker, the household to go get that mortgage, you've got to get lower rates, right? So the actual transmission mechanism to make all this engine work, right? You've got to get the American household to go out and finance their mortgages, keep the economy humming along. How do you do that? Put some stability under the 10-year, get that lower, right? And so that's the kind of the policy direction we're seeing kind of take hold. So that's going to come. I mean, it could be any time now, but that's really what you want to see, right? It's supposed to be counter-cyclical. We want to get housing back on track. That alone isn't going to solve that downward trend that's in the time series for housing starts, starting in 2022. But it gets us out of the kind of the trough of the cycle would be what I'd expect. Now, all right. And I think the last thing we'll talk about before we shut it down for the day, we've talked about U.S. commercial banks' balance sheet expansion. Now, all else aside, we talked about stable coins are coming for this business, massive disruptions in place. That's definitely true. But that integration is going to take time, like years, to fully play out. So we'll be talking about that development for the next 5 to 10 years, I'm sure. So long as Cameron and I keep recording every week, we'll be tracking. But right now, stable coins outstanding, right? Tether's about 155 billion, Circle 68 billion. If you add up those in terms of crypto stable coins, right, and then market size, bank deposits in the U.S. commercial bank system are like 16 or 17 trillion. So it's a massive amount of room, but before those markets, kind of you see the true disruptive innovation crossover and unseat the incumbent. That's well into the future. Still, you could call it speculative. But you talk about the short term. How do you get this, current credit system and the federal debt, all of that humming along, just to continue into the next stage? Well, I think at this stage, what we've talked about post tariffs, right? What did we say we expected? Balance sheet expansion coming from banks, right? You get nominal GDP running hot by incentivizing credit creation in the domestic U.S. economy. Some of that can come from unregulated banks. There's definitely going to be a heavy portion of that, but a lot of it is going to show up in the call it the legacy or traditional banking system. And so now what we're seeing, we've got enough data on the H.8 weekly reports. They're about almost 2 weeks delayed in terms of the snapshot of where the Fed gets the balance sheet holdings requests. What I've got here is the annualized growth rates on a look back window for the collective commercial bank's balance sheet in the U.S. and then broken down by line item, like loan type, asset class, all of that. And then what you would do is add these together. But the final number, what we're seeing on a look back window, so if you go to like the April 30th column, ever since that initial dip, right, we've seen the total balance sheet of the commercial banking system expanding at a 15% annualized growth rate. If we were to extrapolate April 30th to May 28th, or sorry, it's actually closer than that. I think it's like June 5th would be the latest snapshot, right? Um, and granted, there's some like that may be too hot because of a measurement because we know after tax day on April 15th, a bunch of deposits leave the commercial banking system and they enter the TGA at the Fed. Um, so these may be overclocking the rate of growth, but a 15% growth rate would be very high for the commercial banking system. And where is that growth showing up, right? 13.9% of it right now is in cash assets, right? So that's additive. 13.9, and then the other 1.1 comes from other stuff. You call it bank credit, right? Bank credit on that line, that section above. The bank credit expansion hasn't even really started yet. And then there's a an allowance for loan and lease losses that's taken off 10 bips. That's been recognized so far. So point is, banks are sitting on, the cash is increasing, and you want to get to why. Talked about that. Go back and watch our episode discussing HIBOR and how international money centers, non-U.S. domestic on their dollar deposits are having to. I mean, HIBOR cut to essentially zero, right? And then Fed is holding at 4 with more rate cuts coming, but still direction of flows is pulling deposits into the domestic banking system. If you go to the next slide, Cameron, we are now seeing that trickle into deposit growth. So deposit growth is now heating up, right? 2, 3 weeks ago, last time we checked on this, borrowings was the big contributor, like banks going out and raising, say, a bond in the public markets to obtain money, right? Bank money, dollars. That's shifted over now. Those deposit flows are flowing in, and you've seen this number heat up, increasing. So on a 2-week look back, you've got 17.6 annualized contribution to balance sheet growth, slowed down last week to 14.2. But that effect of dollars sucking into the US banking system because of those high rates, that's happening. And they're sitting on cash right now. As you know, if there is clarity, maybe rates come in as well, that we're not entering some sort of liquidity crisis or a hard landing, maybe would be the term everybody would use for it. So long as we escape that, those cash assets that are building up in bank, they have to go somewhere, right? They're going to go into credit creation is my point here. So I think that's what's going on. We'll leave it there for now, but huge week of developments across what happened in Iran, Genius Act, and the SLR. Hopefully gave you some bearings to help you make sense and absorb these headlines in real time.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt, and thanks to our viewers. We'll see you all next week on Build a Weekly Roundup. Follow us on X, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Have a good week, everybody.
Thanks.